We begin with a very simple example, a horizontal navigation menu with just 4 links in a row. You can surely build this even without Flexbox, probably using inline block or float. But now, let's see how Flexbox makes it easier. Here's the markup. We have the 4 links in an unordered list. And here's some CSS, just some basic styling. I also have this base.css style sheet linked to each of the examples in this course. It contains some general styles applicable to all the demos. You don't need to worry about the style sheet. Back to our markup file. Without using any display inline block or float, our navigation looks like this. Without Flexbox, you would probably add a rule display inline block to each of the li elements like this. However, with CSS Flexbox, instead of adding a rule to all the individual items here, we can add a rule to the immediate parent of these elements, which is the UL element. Add the rule display flex. Save the file, and now you see we get the exact same outcome. So just applying this rule display flex to the parent container makes all the child elements within it appear in a single row. These are tiny little items, so you cannot appreciate the value of Flexbox yet. Let's look at another example. Here's a testimonial section that shows 3 testimonials in a single row. Notice that all the blocks are of the same height but different widths based on the length of the text within. Assume that these testimonials are randomly picked up from the server and displayed, so you don't know the length of each text in advance, so you cannot set a fixed width. The only way to achieve flexible blocks like these based on the content within used to be JavaScript. But with Flexbox, it's super simple. Let's look at the markup first. We have a section within which we have 3 testimonial blocks. Here's some basic styling. And without using float property or setting a width for the testimonial div, this is what we have. To bring these blocks in a single row and make them flexible too, all we need is display flex on the section, which is the immediate parent of the testimonial divs. And that's it. The blocks automatically take up as much space as needed, maintaining the same height. You can cross-check, maybe remove a couple of lines from here. Check again. You see now this is flexible. It's reduced the width based on the content. This is one of the simplest use case of CSS Flexbox using a single CSS rule display flex right here. We'll explore the other CSS properties related to Flexbox. Let's look back at our navigation menu example and get familiar with some important terms before we move on to learn more CSS properties. Look at the markup. To create a Flexbox, we need at least 2 elements, a parent and 1 or more immediate children. Here we have 4 child items. To place all these child items in a single row, we need to apply the rule display flex to the parent and not to the items. All the CSS properties that we learn next will work only when you add the rule display flex. So the parent here is called the flex container, and all these items are called flex items. We will use the terms container and items throughout this course, so remember them. In the previous episode, to add some space between these items, I used a horizontal padding on each li element. Let me inspect element and show you. So each li element has a padding. Setting a padding this way will also add some space at the beginning and ending of the menu like you just saw, and this is not desirable. So instead, let's remove this padding and add a gap using the gap property on the parent container, and here the gap must be 2 times that of the padding because we're combining the left and right padding. Gap of 2.4 rem. And now you see we have the exact same result. And we don't have any unnecessary gaps at the beginning and end of the items. If needed, we can add some additional padding here to the container itself. maybe change that to 2.4 rem, and now this makes more sense. This gap property for Flexbox has recently gained support among major browsers, but if you wish to make your site compatible for IE or other older versions of other browsers, it's better not to use it, or check the compatibility before you use it. You can continue using padding for individual items like we just did before if you don't want to use gap. This was about adding a fixed gap between Flex items. Now when you click on Flex in the Dev Tools, you can see that the container takes up full width of the browser, but these items are stacked up to the left, that is the beginning of the container. Let's say you want to place the menu links at the center, then you can use the property justify content and the value will be center. Let's check. Now the items appear at the center of the container, leaving space on the left and right side. There are other useful values for this property like flex start, which is the default. All the items are stacked to the beginning of the container. Then there's flex end, and you can see all the items are to the right now, stacked to the end of the container. Another commonly used value is space between. You can see what happened. The items are spread out such that the first item is at the start, the last item is at the end, and all other items are evenly spaced in between. There are two more similar values, space around, where you get half the space at the beginning and end too, and then there is space evenly, where, let me remove the gap so you can see it better. Yeah, where the space between the elements and around the elements are same. Let's change this back to center now and also add the gap back. So using the property justify content on the Flex container helps you space out the items and change the placement horizontally. But note one thing, this property only works when there's extra space available in the container. So if we try to reduce the screen size like this and then try to use justify content start end, it might not work. This might seem obvious in this example, but it's important to remember that you can use justify content only if the Flex items don't occupy all the available space in the container. Next, let me close this and let's add a logo to this navbar. Add a list item at the beginning, images/logo.svg. And this is what we get. You might notice that the image is not vertically centered with respect to the text. If you've ever tried vertically aligning an image and text using the CSS vertical align property, you know it never works as expected. But since this is a Flexbox now, we can use a property align items again on the parent container itself, and this value can be set to center to vertically align all the items in the Flexbox to the center. Let me inspect. You can see a line passing through the center of all items. As you might have already guessed, this property align items also has different useful values. If you want all the items aligned at the top, you can use the flex start value. Similarly, if you want them aligned at the bottom, you can use flex end. Now you see they're all at the bottom. We also have another interesting value, baseline. This ensures that all the text gets aligned at the bottom. The baseline might look similar to flex end, but it's not. To demonstrate the difference, let me add some padding to the first li element, with the link. So here, padding 0.25 rem. And now you see that since we have this value set to baseline, you didn't see this link jumping. If this was flex end, you'll see that the bottom of the whole link is aligned with the other items. But when you set this to baseline, the padding is ignored and the text is aligned instead. So that's the difference. So depending on the situation, you can use either of these values. But the default value for align items property is stretch. So if you don't set align items, the flex items stretch to the full height of the container by default. To understand this better, let's go back to our testimonial section example. Instead of flexible width here, if we had a fixed width for each item, let's say something like width 14 rem, all the blocks still occupy the same height. This is the default behavior. The flex items stretch to occupy full height because we haven't used align items property to specify otherwise. So you can change this. Let's go to the parent container, and if we add align items and set it to anything other than stretch, like flex start, flex end, center, you will see the difference. Getting back to the navigation example, let's revise what we learned in this episode. To add some fixed spacing between flex items, we can use the gap property. It adds space only between the elements and not around them. To modify placement of the flex items horizontally with respect to the container, we can use the property justify content. And to modify alignment of these items vertically, we can use align items. With this much knowledge, let's see if we can solve the famous CSS problem, how to center a div on page. Let's look at the markup for this. We have a section and our div that needs to be in the center of this full page section. The basic styles for the div are up here. Now for this div to be in the center of the screen, we first need the section to occupy full screen. Right now, you can give it a background of, let's say, dark gray or dark blue, and see that it occupies full width but not the full height. So let's remove this and make it occupy full space, full screen by adding a width of 100%, though it's the default. Let's also add a height, a min height of 100 viewport height. Next, if we turn the section into a flex container, we can align this flex item horizontally and vertically by using the CSS properties we just learned, right? So let's add display flex. Now the section is a flex container. Our div is the only flex item, and that's totally fine. Do you remember the CSS property to modify the horizontal placement of flex items? Yes, it's justify content. The value we need here is center. What do we have now? The item is horizontally aligned as expected, but it's taking up full height because remember, the flex items stretch to occupy the full height of the container by default. Do we know how to change that? Yes, using align items, and the value again is center. There we go, our div at the center of the page, and now we actually understand how it works too. So remember, to center an element within another, you need that item as the only flex item in its parent, and you only need to add these 3 CSS rules to the parent. With this, let's proceed and learn more. We take a look at a new example, a section that displays some logos of happy customers of the product. By now, you already know how to implement this using Flexbox. Let's look at the markup. We have a section with a paragraph of text and 3 images. Here are some basic styles again. Of course, without Flexbox, this is what we have. Since the paragraph element is a block level element, it creates a new line, whereas the images are inline elements, so they are placed next to each other by default. Let's first turn the parent into a flex container. To the section element, add display flex. Okay. Now we have everything in a single row, but the images stretch full height by default, which is bad. So let's change the vertical alignment using, yes, align items, and the value we use is center. This should be good. The only thing missing is some gap. So let's add a gap of maybe 2.4 rem. Perfect. This is great. But what if we want to add two more logos here? Let's add them and see what happens. Let me copy these, place here, logo 4, logo 5. Alright, we still have all the child elements in a single row even though there isn't enough space. Can Flexbox not push the items to the next row if there's no space? Yes, it can. You just have to instruct it to do so. That's done using the property flex wrap. If you want the items to wrap into multiple rows, the value is wrap. And it's done. Some items now move into the next row. We might also want to center these, so let's change the horizontal placement using justify content center. Just reiterating, this rule is for horizontally aligning or centering the items within the container, and this rule here is for vertically centering them relative to each other, right? Yes, this looks much better. Now this section is responsive too. Do you want to see that? You see, we have not added any media queries, but the section is responsive by just adding the rule flex wrap wrap. Now there are other values for this property. Let's look into them. Section flex wrap. One of the values is no wrap. That's the default behavior anyway. But in case you have set this property to wrap using media queries and for another device size you want to change that, then you can override it with flex wrap no wrap. Another interesting value is, let me show you. It's called wrap reverse. Did you just see what happened? Instead of wrapping from top to bottom, the rows now start from bottom and then wrap to the top. I'm not sure where this would be useful, but this value exists anyway. Alright, there's one more thing I'd like to show you here. Let me close this, refresh, go back. Let's increase the height of the flex container and see what happens. Let me add a min height of about 30 rem to the flex container. Did you expect this to happen? The rows are now spaced out vertically. So yes, there is yet another property that can be used to control the spacing between the rows that got created due to wrapping. And that property is align content. Align content. I know this must be getting confusing. Actually, you might never need to use this property, but it's just good to know. That's why I'm showing it to you. The values for this are similar to that of justify content. So first, let's set this to flex start. Now the rows are stacked up at the start of the container vertically. If we change this, let me inspect. And if we change the value of align content to flex end, this is what we have. They are stacked up at the end of the container. And then center, they are at the middle. We again have space between, space around, and space evenly. You've already seen this with respect to justify content, so I'm not going to explain them. Let me change this back to center. So you will need to use this property align content only if you have flex items wrapped into multiple rows and you want to control the spacing between those rows. If there's only one row of items, or if the height of the container is not bigger than needed, this property has no effect. Let's move on. So far, we saw that with Flexbox, we can stack all the immediate child items in a single row. However, you can also stack all these items into a single column instead, that is vertically one below the other, by adding a rule flex direction column. That is, you're changing the direction to column. This is what we get. This would be useful, let's say, if you have only 3 logos and you don't want them to wrap for smaller devices, but instead display one below the other like this. So what you do is remove this line from here, add some media queries, at media screen and max width 767 pixels. So below 767 pixels for the section, let's change the flex direction to column. This is what we have for larger screen sizes, and for smaller screen sizes, we get them one below the other. You may think this is the default browser behavior anyway. Why do we need to use Flexbox at all for mobile screens? We can simply change display flex to display block instead, right, for smaller devices? Well, there are a few good reasons. Let's try changing this to display block and see what we get. Firstly, we lost our gap and the center alignment. And secondly, for slightly larger screens below the breakpoint, you see, because our images are inline elements, we don't get what we expect. So let's go back and change this to flex direction column. So we're retaining display flex. We're just changing the direction to column for smaller devices. This right here, this is not mobile first approach, but I always like to follow that. What we can do instead is change the max width to min width. So all these styles will be for mobile and these will be for larger devices. So instead of adding flex direction column here, we'll have to add it here because these are the mobile styles. And here we'll have to change it back to row. So row is the other value, the default. Let's check if we still have the same result. Yes, this is for smaller devices, and for larger ones, we have them in a row. Great. While we are at it, let's see two more values that flex direction offers. We've seen row and column. We also have row reverse, where the items go from right to left instead of left to right. And then we also have column reverse, where the items go from bottom to top instead of top to bottom. One of the best use cases of row reverse value is for websites that support both left to right and right to left languages like Arabic. In such cases, you can keep the markup the same and just change the flex direction to row reverse when you're switching the language. Now let's look at some interesting use cases for column direction. Take a look at the simple login screen for mobile layout. We have two buttons vertically centered on the page. Let's see how to build this. Here's the markup, a section element with two links styled as buttons. And I've set display block for the links so that they occupy full width. And the section is set to a fixed width and height just for demo purpose. And this is what we have to begin with. This right here is the section. Alright, with the concepts you have learned so far, you know how to center a div. So one of the ways of achieving this layout is to wrap these two buttons within an additional div and center that div within the section. But assuming that we cannot change the markup right here by adding an additional div, or we don't want to add unnecessary markup, how do we vertically center both these buttons? Yes, you can use the column direction in Flexbox. Let me show you. First, turn the section element into a flex container by adding display flex. Let's also add flex direction column. This doesn't change anything. This gives us exactly what we had before, but we'll change that soon. Let's add a gap of 1 rem. And now to center both the items vertically, add justify content center. There, we have the desired outcome. But wait, isn't justify content property used for horizontal alignment of flex items? How did this affect the vertical alignment then? This is where a lot of beginners get confused with Flexbox. So observe carefully now. There are some concepts we need to understand first. We saw two examples. The navigation menu example, where the flex items are placed horizontally in a row, and now the login screen example where the buttons or items are placed vertically, that is in a column. When the flex direction is row, The x-axis is the main axis. That's the direction in which items are laid out. And the other axis, that is the y-axis, is called cross-axis. But when the flex direction is column, the y-axis becomes the main axis because the items are laid out in that direction, and so the x-axis becomes the cross-axis here. It's the reverse. The property justify content controls alignment along the main axis. That's why we were able to center the menu items horizontally using justify content in the first example, and for the login screen we use the same property to align the buttons vertically instead. That is the main axis here. Similarly, the align items property controls alignment along the cross axis. So for row direction, that would be vertical alignment, but for column direction, that would be horizontal alignment. Yes, I know this is confusing at the beginning, but after we practice with a few more examples, you'll get a hang of it. So coming back to our login screen, now that we know justify content controls alignment along the main axis, which is vertical in this case, we can modify the value and see for ourselves. Inspect. Let me close responsive view and justify content. Set this to flex start, flex end, or space between, space around, space evenly, and so on. Let's change it back to center. And how about align items? It controls alignment along the cross axis. In this case, it's horizontal direction, right? Let's apply different values to that as well and see what happens. Align items, flex start. So you see them change in the horizontal direction, flex end. Then we have center, and baseline doesn't have any effect for column direction. And then finally we have stretch, which is also the default. That's why we can skip setting align items altogether for this example. Now let's look at another component to reinforce what we just learned. This is a single testimonial block from our first example. We have the quote symbol, the testimonial paragraph, and the name of the person. Assume that this div has some varying width and height based on the screen dimension, but regardless of that, we want the quote to always be at the top, the name at the complete bottom, which we don't, and then the text, the paragraph in between. So we want the items to spread out completely, creating equal space in between. Can you try this out on your own? Let's look at the markup. Here's the div, and we have three items: image, paragraph, and span. So first, we add display flex to the testimonial div, and then change the direction to column because we want the items to continue to stay one below the other. And now we want to space out the elements vertically, that is along the main axis. So the property we use is justify content, and the value we need is space between. Great. Now, what if we also want all these to be horizontally centered? We want to change the alignment in the horizontal direction, which is the cross axis. So we use align items, center. We also need to center this text, so we can add P, text align center. This is now perfect. So we learned about flex directions and how to place and align items in different situations based on the main axis and the cross axis. Most of the web page sections today use flex direction column for mobile and smaller screen layouts, and beyond a certain breakpoint, change the flex direction to row for larger screen sizes. Take a look at this common layout with a sidebar on the left and a main section on the right. Let's look at the markup. We have the nav element for the sidebar and section for the main section on the right. Scroll up to the styles. I've added a fixed width to the nav element and a min height of 100 VH to both nav and section, so both of them span full height. This is what we have without Flexbox, nav element, and below that the main section. Now you already know how to bring them next to each other. Nav and section are both child elements of the body directly, so we can add display flex to the body element itself. Display flex. That's it, right? This should be sufficient. Let's see. But what happens? We see some space left over here. The flex items occupy only as much space as needed, so the remaining space in the container is left blank. This is the expected behavior. The side navigation is anyway fixed width, but we'd like to expand this main section to occupy the leftover space. How do we do that? We can't assign it a fixed width because it needs to be responsive to different screen sizes. There's a property for that in Flexbox. Let's see. We want the section element to expand and occupy the leftover space, so we can select section and use the property flex grow. Now this is a property that takes in numbers as values. We can set this to 1. Let's see. Now we get exactly what we want. If we set flex grow to 0, it doesn't grow, meaning it occupies only as much space as required. So if you don't specify flex grow, the value is 0 by default. What exactly is this property? So far, we've seen properties like justify content, align items, align content, flex direction, and all these properties were applied to the flex container. But flex grow is not applied to the container, it is applied to one or more flex items. We set flex grow 1 to the section. What happens if we set flex grow to the nav, the other child item also? Let's do that in the browser and check. Open DevTools. Now let me put this at the bottom so we can see clearly what's happening. Now the section has flex grow as 1. Now to the nav also let's add flex grow as 1. Did you see? The nav also expanded to occupy some of the space left out in the container, though we specified a fixed width for it. Now if we set the sections flex grow to 0, that is remove this, the nav itself occupies all the leftover space. We can also change this number, maybe set it to 2. Now you see that it expands by a little more space, or you can do 3, you can do 4, and so on. What exactly is happening and how exactly are the widths calculated? Let's see. Let's change this back to 0 and nav also to 0. Firstly, the browser lays out the flex items based on their initial width like so. Then, if there's additional space available in the container, let's see how much space is available. We have about 400 pixels left over in the container. So then the browser checks for flex grow in all the items within the container. Now let's say nav has flex grow 1 and we also have sections flex grow as 1. Since both the items have flex grow as 1, it divides the additional space in the ratio 1:1 and adds them to both these items. Initially, nav was, let's calculate this, was about 255 pixels. Now after adding flex grow 1 to both, the space was 400 pixels, which gets divided in 1:1 ratio. So this should have got additional 200 pixels. So that's 255 plus 200, which is 455 exactly. Now if we change the flex grow of section to 2 instead, the space is divided in the ratio 2:1 and added to the initial width. Anyway, we don't have to do any of these calculations ever. It's just for your understanding. So setting flex grow as 1 to section and not to the nav fixes our sidebar problem. Let's look at another example. Here's a blog post summary with image, heading, paragraph, and link. I have already added display flex to the parent along with flex direction column and some gap. Now this paragraph and heading are dynamic. That means they can occupy The heading can occupy 1 line, 2 lines, or 3 lines, and the paragraph can also increase in text. So you notice that when the paragraph is small, the button floats up. If there are more lines in the paragraph, then the button appears at the bottom nicely. Now, how do we make sure that irrespective of the length of the heading and text, the button always stays at the bottom? There's additional space right now in the container which we want to shift to the paragraph by using the Flex Grow property. Let's do that. To the paragraph element P, let's add Flex Grow 1 so that all the other elements are of their initial size, but the paragraph occupies the leftover space. And now we have the button at the bottom irrespective of the length of the text here. So you've seen how Flex Grow is helpful in both row and column directions. When we talk about Flex Grow, we have to talk about another property too. We'll do that with a different example. Let's say we have the simple movie booking component with the image on the left, title and paragraph in the middle, and the button on the right. In the markup, we have the movie section with the image and a div that contains both heading and paragraph, then a link that looks like a button. Starting from the beginning, that is without using Flexbox, this is what we have. Now let's bring all these three in a row using Flex. So to the section element, add display flex and a gap of about 1 rem. We get this, but the button is stretching full height. So let's change the vertical alignment with align items center. Alright, now we have two problems. If the description is too short, like in the first section, our button is not pushed to the end. We already know how to solve this problem from our previous example, right? Yes, we can make this div grow to occupy the additional space on the right. Let's do that. Movie div, and we can say Flex Grow 1. That's good. It solves our first problem of description not being long enough. But in the second section, the description is long and it makes the button get compressed because all the flex items try to occupy least space to fit into one row. But we don't want the button to shrink this way. So the way we can make flex items grow when there's more space available, similarly, we can also stop the items from shrinking when there's less space available. So for the button, we can do that using the property Flex Shrink. Movie A, use the property Flex Shrink and set that to 0. So we are saying don't shrink. Right? So the button doesn't shrink even if there's less space, which makes the other items in the row shrink. So here we have the description, we have the div shrinking a little to make space for the button. Now this solves our second problem too. Flex Shrink also accepts other numbers like 1, 2 and so on. If it's 0, the item does not shrink at all. The higher the number, the more it shrinks compared to other items if there's less space in the container. But the most used values are either 1 or 0. So we learned about two properties in this episode, Flex Grow and Flex Shrink. Flex Grow is a property used to increase the size of flex items based on the space available, and Flex Shrink is the property used to reduce the size when there's less space available in the container. Important thing to remember is that the default value of Flex Grow is 0 and Flex Shrink is 1. That is, all the flex items will occupy only as much space as required. They do not grow by default and they will shrink when the space is less. Let's change it back and we'll move on to look at another common layout, a pricing plans section with 3 equal sized blocks. This used to be quite difficult without Flexbox. You had to calculate the padding, the margin, and then set widths of the blocks. But with Flex, Here's how it's done. We have a section with 3 divs. We've set display flex and a gap of 1.5 rem to the parent. And to each of the divs, we've set a width of 33.33%. Each block does not occupy exactly 33.33% for sure because of all the gaps and padding. But since they all shrink by the same amount, they all end up with the same width. Now, instead of using the width property here, we can specify the same using another property, flex basis. What's the difference? Actually, not much, but the browser looks for this property flex basis first and sets the initial item size to this value. If this property is not found, then it looks for width in case of row direction or height in case of column direction. So with flex basis, we can set the initial width of an item. In case flex direction is column, then the same property is used to set the initial height, not the width. Now, why do I say initial? Because after this size is set for all items, based on the space available in the container, the items may grow or shrink. So whenever needed, it's better to set the flex basis of an item to define the initial size. Now we can achieve this layout in another way too. When we want all equal sized items, we can set the initial width to 0, that is flex basis to 0%, and then set flex grow for each of the items to 1. Flex grow 1. Flex basis 0% and flex grow 1. Let's check if we have the same output. Yes, we do. Now, why is this better? Because now we can add another item, say copy this and paste it, and still all 4 blocks take up the same space. If flex basis was 33.33%, we had to change it to 25, and when we remove a block, let's say we remove and we're left with only 2 blocks, we have to again change it to 50%. But now because we have set it to 0 and flex grow to 1, all the blocks, irrespective of how many blocks within the container, all the items occupy the same amount of space. Isn't that great? Alright, so from the previous lesson, you've seen 3 new properties. That is flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. For every item, by default, flex grow is 0, flex shrink is 1, and flex basis is auto. All these 3 properties can be combined into a single flex shorthand property. Now this takes in 3 values in the order flex grow, flex grow, flex shrink is the second value, and flex basis as the third value. So looking at these values right here, the value of flex shorthand property is 0, 1, auto. So for our div here, we can replace this with the single shorthand property flex. The first value is flex grow. We want that to be 1. Flex shrink can be 1. And then flex basis is 0%. Let's verify in the browser. Yes, everything is the same. If you get confused, you can check the dev tools. Inspect. Let me put this back to the right. Yeah, and here you can see for the property flex, when you use the shorthand flex property, you can expand and see each of the values flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. So you can check these and fix them if you've gone wrong. Going back, now it's always good to specify all these 3 values to avoid confusion, but it's not necessary. This property flex can take in a single value also, or double values, or all 3 values. Now let's see what it means when a single value is specified. So if I just say flex 1, that is, we specify a number here, that number is considered as flex grow, and then by default flex shrink will be 1 and flex basis will be 0%. So flex 1 is same as flex 1, 1, 0%. And that's what we have here. But if this single value is a percentage, pixels or rem, then something like 10 rem, then it's considered as the flex basis value, that is 10 rem, and then flex grow is 1, flex shrink is 1 as well. How about two values, like say 1 and 1? When you use two values, the first one should always be a number. Now this cannot be 10 rem or this cannot be 0%. It either has to be 0, 1, 2 and so on. So if it's 1 and 1, the first value is always the flex grow value. The second value can either be a number like this or a percentage like this. Now when the second value is a number, that's equivalent to flex shrink. If it's a value, then that's equivalent to flex basis. If all this shorthand syntax is confusing to use, don't use it. You are free to specify all three values exactly like this. But if you're working with someone else's code and they use it, now you know how to decode and understand this shorthand property. So we can replace with just flex 1. And if I add flex 1 to all the items in a particular flex container, then they all occupy equal width. Let's check again. That's right. And now if I add flex 2 to the plan height, item, flex 2, that is flex grow is 2, flex shrink is 1 and flex basis is 0%. This is same as adding this. So flex 2, then you see that this item occupies 2 times the width as the first item. So when you need objects in a particular proportion, you can use the flex shorthand property and use those proportions right here. Let me remove all of this. Right, there it is. So now you also know how to size your flex items in proportion to each other. Lastly, the flex property also takes in some keywords as values. They are flex initial, auto, and none. Initial is the default, that is, the flex item occupies just as much space as needed, does not grow but can shrink. So initial is simply flex 0, 1 and auto. That is, it does not grow, shrinks if needed, and occupies auto space based on the width or some other property. Just as much space is needed. Now this is initial. Auto is the same as initial but grows if needed. So it's 1, 1 auto. And then none means the flex item neither grows nor shrinks. So that item is not flexible. Flex none will be 0, 0 auto. It's not flexible at all. Once again, you don't have to remember these values right away. But if you see them somewhere, you can look them up, and with practice, you'll slowly be able to use them too. So summarizing this episode, we learned that flex basis is a property that specifies the initial size of the flex item. That's the same as width for row direction and height for column direction. We have a shorthand flex property that combines the three properties flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis that takes in multiple types of values. So this flex property determines the size of the item and how it shrinks or grows in the container.